So, Stephen, thank you for taking the time to meet with me today to talk through how to become a Scrum Master.
Thanks, Justin.
All right. Do you want to jump right in?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Okay. So, I think the first question is, what led you to coaching? What sort of coalesced in your thought that said, I want to become a coach?
So, I have always wanted to do software better. I call myself a pre-manifesto agilist.
Okay.
Because I started trying to apply a lot of the writings of some of the early guys back in the late 90s and stuff, and was applying it fairly successfully, and teams really liked a lot of it, especially the stuff that sort of converged into XP, and then saw a lot of good examples along the way, got to sort of somewhat accidentally work one step removed from some of the greats, and so it was comfortable and familiar. And I got into a position at one company where I was an engineering manager, but it was as part of an overall agile transformation. And when I decided to leave there, the opportunity that opened up to me was one of that I got to craft somewhat for myself, which was essentially as a coach. And so I sort of woke up one day and realized that I had become an agile coach. But it was based on a fairly long history and a fairly solid set of background and practice over the years and so on.
Yeah, so what do you look for? How do you go through and figure out this is a person who's going to help the organization, this is a person who maybe is not a good fit, and right. By fit I mean they don't necessarily have the principles that you're looking to have in a person to join your team. And I know executives sometimes ask the question, well, how do I know? Sometimes right. People want a checklist,
right.
And that might not necessarily be the right way to go about it. So how do you do it and trust the decision that you've made?
Well, and based on the way, you wrote some of the questions, it's clear that you're making the distinction, too, between a Scrum Master and an Agile coach.
Yes. So I guess why don't we start there? How do you think of Scrum Master versus what an Agile coach is?
Strictly speaking,
okay.
I think of a Scrum Master as a role from Scrum.
Mm-hmm.
Practically, I tend to flex that a little bit and see it as more of a spectrum between a Scrum Master and an Agile coach. Yes. So part of the reason I have the laptop open here is that part of the preparation that I did for getting people ready to interview Scrum Masters is I had to be able to tell them exactly what they were looking for.
Okay, great.
And, your question asked for 2 or 3 things, and I have this very full double-column page of attributes. But there's attitudes and attributes, soft skills, hard skills, and knowledge. And then, within the attitudes and aptitudes, I have servant leader, communicative and social, assertive, enthusiasm, empowerment, transparency, not necessarily consistent in whether they're adjectives or attributes or whatever, but soft skills, situational awareness, conflict resolution, accomplishment through influence, facilitation, coaching, inquiry, and some others. Knowledge, understands the agile mindset and the reasons for it, not just the mechanics, iterative development, fundamentals of software development processes and procedures. Hard skills, Scrum, Kanban, planning, poker facilitation, risk assessment, forecasting, presentation and visualization, gamification, story slicing. How do you
evaluate and help them advance their craft? How do you help them get better? Right, so you hire someone who will say, clearly is a Scrum Master, and they may have not ever worked with a team before, but based upon the list that you identified, they meet a lot of the criteria.
Right.
So you know that you've got a good candidate, but they've not necessarily actually worked as being a Scrum Master, or they may have been a project manager for 10 years or something along those lines, but they have the EQ, and they have all the things that you need.
Yep.
Right. How do you set them up for success? What does that look like?
So I made a sort of forward mention earlier to something else about building a team, and I think it plays into this. A lot of us, we've heard about the thing about a T-shaped skill set, the idea of the specializing generalist. And the idea there is that, you have this bar of the T, which is the base that anybody in this role should have. They should be able to do pretty much the full spectrum, almost to, the extent to some depth of skill. But then there are certain areas within that where they have specialty. And I don't know where it came from originally. I know that probably one of the last places I saw it was in Lisa Crispin and Janet Gregory's More Agile Testing book. There's also this concept that takes the T-shaped individual and talks about composing the T's to form a square-shaped team, where the specialties that everybody brings to the table complement each other in a way that everybody can learn from one another. And one of the biggest models that gets thrown out there a lot is that of the Navy SEAL team, composed of a unit of 12 people with 4 different specialties, where you have, 2 in each of, who are top experts in some of the specialties, and then everybody else is cross-trained so that, you have a little bit of redundancy as far as people with, that as the primary expertise, and then you also have, the ability for everybody else to continue to survive and get by, even if those 2 people are gone. And for them, gone is a realistic possibility rather than, something we don't have to necessarily deal with in software.
Definitely.
But, and so in forming the team, understand what are the specializations that you want, what are the specializations that you need, how do they complement one another. I like those last 2 questions about advice. What advice do you have for anyone who's embarking on an agile transformation, and what advice do you have specifically for a Scrum Master in the midst of a transformation?
Okay, well, why don't we start there? Anyone watching the video doesn't have to wait. They can.
There you go.
We can just talk about it now.
As far as the advice, the entire organization needs to understand that they're going to have to change.
And let's talk about that very specifically, because my experience is different than yours. So when you say change, I think we'll start from a classically sort of set up product engineering organization where there's a PMO, and we'll say there's product managers, and then there's going to be engineering managers, and there's directors of engineering, right? And so it's sort of your typical sort of triangle.
Right.
And you have a user experience group, and for the sake of this conversation, we'll say that they're separate, and they have their own sort of design thinking setup, and people need to work with them, but they're not part of the product engineering organization. So
And that's one of the first things that has to change.
Well, I know that. You know that. I think we both know that. So with that sort of setup, how do you start? Do you start with the bottom up? Do you start with top down? Do you start with both and sort of try and work both towards the middle? Or is there another way that you would recommend?
Depends on where the transformation comes from.
Sure.
But typically, you need to work from both ends. The bottom up is where you need to sort of coach the teams, because there's a lot in terms of day-to-day practices that are going to change. The degree of success you can have with that is going to depend on how broadly you can expand the involvement. So, when we were talking about, there's this user experience group that's entirely separate, and this is a little bit of something that I draw from more of a lean background, is whenever I see a handoff, whenever I see groups that are doing something for another group rather than doing something with another group, that's a red flag for me. And there's a couple aspects in that. One of those is that it's probably at least partially motivated by some idea of utilization. It's not efficient to have one designer on every team. What do you mean by efficient, right? Because what you need to do in order to do this, you don't just want to turn an organization into a bunch of little waterfalls that operate on shorter time boxes. The idea of hey, we still hand off designs to, requirements to designers, and designs to developers, and developers to implementation, who then hand it off to testers, who then hand it off to the operations folks to deploy. You're still doing a phase gate kind of thing, and maybe you're doing it in the span of a 2-week to 4-week sprint. You're not really doing Agile the way it's described in the Agile Manifesto.
Okay, and so to that point, I'm sure there's someone who hopefully is going to be watching this, right? Who will say, Yes, but, you know, the Scrum but.
Yes.
In our organization,
Right.
we can't. So there are people who are, I'll say the ones that I've been involved with, there are people in gaming who suggest, hey, our code base is so large and integrated that it's not a 3-tier architecture, it's not using SOA, so we have to work in this 4-week sprint, right? So that's one. People in defense, oh my gosh, I feel like everyone in defense this is how we have to work. And then I'll say, I love my financial services folks, but it seems like we're special because we're working with things that
Our time is money. We don't have the time to interact with the team.
And everyone needs to have trust that our code is solid. And
Right.
I've worked in all 3 of those industries and then some others. And while I have an opinion, I want to hear what your opinion is on that exact topic.
So there's a couple of things there, but one of the important ones is this is where the change needs to happen at a higher level, where the top-down needs to happen. If you have managers, directors, executives who insist on maintaining the territorial fiefdom boundaries between, especially along functional lines, you are doomed to hit a wall at some point.
Okay, so we've got that.
And if they're not willing to change in that regard, then you are limited in how far you can take your transformation. There was a question that we sort of touched on a bit at a little bit more of an organizational level, but we haven't done it at a team level, which is sort of how do you decide what to do with a team? How do you decide what they need?
Sure, and since this is mostly focused for people who are learning how to be Scrum Masters, why don't we spend a minute talking about that?
So the first thing is to recognize there's not going to be a recipe.
So for those people who are looking for a checklist, then
the checklist should be the things you watch for, not necessarily the order you attack them. Remember, and they should almost have it like tattooed on their forehead, is I'm not actually here to promote a process.
So then what are people here to do?
I'm here to get things done.
Awesome. Okay, so
I'm here to help the company realize delivery of value to its customers and users.
Okay, and so how does the Scrum Master help facilitate that concept, what you're talking about?
They need to try to make sure that the team is composed of everybody involved in delivering the experience and not just think of it as delivering the software.
Okay, and then for the people who are out there who are thinking, hey, but we already have an organization that's got a PMO that does that. What's the nuance? Break apart for me what you understand the nuance to be between a Scrum Master helping to make sure a product gets to market with all of the accoutrement, whatever that would mean, and then let's have a project manager, PMO, not a Scrum Master approach to doing that. What's the difference?
Handoffs again. You know, we talked earlier about whether or not you have handoffs and whether those are a red flag.
Okay.
If you say, hey, we hand the software off and then marketing figures out how to market it, or marketing's running off in parallel, not coordinating with, you know, what we're doing, or we're going to deliver the software and we don't know whether or not the physical assets are going to be ready, or the real estate, or the inventory, or whether there's going to be a marketing campaign, or any of that kind of stuff. If that stuff isn't at least highly coordinated and hopefully done very collaboratively, because there's a lot of opportunity for interplay. If you want to really market something well, you need to really understand what it is, and you don't want to go market something that it isn't.
Fair enough.
Right?
Customers won't
And so if the team and marketing, for example, and I'm just picking on those two, if the software team and the marketing team people aren't working together, or at least coordinating and collaborating pretty closely, you're likely to get this mismatch where, hey, we marketed something that we don't have to deliver, or we're delivering something that never got marketed, and by the way, it's really important. Okay. And so there's a lot of elements of that. And so really keeping focused on the value is also the thing that lets you understand when the process isn't working.
And how do you, and because we're trying to help Scrum Masters here, people know
Right.
that they're a good Scrum Master and that how would you advise a Scrum Master to not work against what sounds like might be their self-interest, but how do they support the team knowing that it, I'll say, should dovetails with other teams?
Right.
So that it's a natural fit versus building any resistance or.
And I would say it's almost impossible for somebody to be a pure, only team-focused Scrum Master in the context of an organizational transformation. Because you need to start expanding your awareness out to the overall transformational goals and at least taking your cues from the people who are working to orchestrate it, who have more of a systemic view, who have more experience, who are more of the full-blown agile coaches, and coordinate with them to make sure that what you're doing at the team level aligns with that overall transformational intent. And as you grow in your skills and abilities, learn how to still be able to work with the team in the context of being a Scrum Master, but use it to start to coach and advise and steer in ways that move them forward on a more broad agenda.
Okay.
And so you might as well just not consider them as part of the development staff at that point. And so the question is, do you really not have the budget for it, or are you just pretending you don't have the budget for it? Now, if you can't convince management of that, you at least need to acknowledge it within the team. And so I generally, like if I'm doing some sort of like team strength weighting on velocity or something like that, I don't consider the person who has that dual role to be part of the predictable velocity.
Okay. Which do you use? And which is right when?
Planning poker is the beginning of the road, not the end of the road.
Mm-hmm.
It is, in my mind, first and foremost, a tool that helps you catalyze the right conversation about the work. And secondarily, and a fairly far second in my mind, calculate your capacity for the next sprint. And any other use for it, is somewhere between a far, far third and utter nonsense.
Okay.
Story points are inherently unreliable. We're typically using them on a time window where the variability doesn't support their use for analysis and predictability purposes. And they are an unstable, even when properly used, they are unstable over long periods of time. And so they're not really the sort of quality foundation that, now they do tend to have a slow drift rather than a fast drift, which, helps with some of the longer term usages that people put them to. But in general, they're not the be-all, end-all that people think they are. But most of the tools let you look at the cycle time while you're doing story pointing. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to start relying on cycle time until you have stability in that metric. Mm-hmm. And until you know how to... So really, I consider there to be two gating factors to whether or not you can jettison story points and planning poker.
Speak on it.
One is, do you know how to have the right conversations about the work? And two, is your cycle time stable enough over the time intervals you need to report on for it to actually be statistically meaningful? So cycle time is great, and if you need to produce forecasts, then it's a better way to do it because you're no longer basing it on opinions, you're basing it on data. But like all financial instruments say, past performance is not a guarantee of future performance. And so, you change projects as different technologies, you get new members on the team, you have people leave, so on and so forth. And all of these things will affect, if not absolutely invalidate, cycle time, story points, everything. And if you really, really have a mature organization, you'll probably jettison the whole thing and just focus on delivering what you think has the most value and delivering frequently and iteratively and go full bore into the no estimates camp.
All right. Let's leave it there because I think that's where a lot of us who have practiced sort of end up getting because you are working with customers frequently enough that you know when is right to release.
There's a conundrum there too, but we won't get into that.
We'll save that for another conversation.
Yeah.